The changing of the guard had just ended, and the sound of boots marching in unison slowly faded into the background. Tourists gathered near the gates, taking pictures of Buckingham Palace, eager to capture the moment. King Charles stepped outside, taking a rare stroll alone. His life was full of responsibilities, endless meetings, and expectations, so this quiet moment was precious. He wasn't looking for anything unusual, just a breath of fresh air to clear his thoughts. But then, something caught his eye. Near the palace entrance, a guard at his post accidentally dropped something. A small, worn-out notebook slipped from his sleeve and landed on the cobblestone ground. It was old, its edges frayed, something most people wouldn't even notice. But Charles did. For a brief moment, the guard hesitated as if unsure whether to break his rigid stance to pick it up. That's when Charles did something unexpected. He bent down and picked it up himself. "Here," Charles said, holding out the notebook. The guard stiffened, his hand firm as he took it back. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes revealed something else. There was a flicker of discomfort, maybe even embarrassment. Charles couldn't quite understand why, but as he straightened up, his gaze lingered for just a moment longer. That's when he noticed something strange. The guard's uniform wasn't right. At first glance, it looked like the usual red tunic, crisp and perfectly fitted. But up close, something was off. The fabric was slightly faded, the cuffs not as sharp as they should be. Near the bottom hem of his jacket, there was a faint stain. It was subtle, but Charles noticed. He studied the guard's face, searching for an explanation, but the man had already returned to his strict posture, eyes forward as if nothing had happened. Charles walked away, but the moment stayed with him. The royal guards were held to the highest standards. Their uniforms were always spotless, always perfect. By the time he reached the palace doors, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that man. And he was going to find out what. Back inside the palace, the image of the guard wouldn't leave Charles's mind. The hesitation, the uniform, the uneasiness in his expression, it was more than just a small stain on a jacket. Something was off. That evening, as he sat in his study, he casually brought it up to his senior aide, Sir Edward. "I had an odd moment earlier," Charles said, absent-mindedly stirring his tea. One of the guards, his uniform wasn't quite right. Looked worn and dirty. Sir Edward barely looked up from his stack of papers. "They stand for hours, Your Majesty. Perhaps he's just due for a fresh set." Charles frowned. Perhaps. But he wasn't convinced. The royal guards took pride in their uniforms. They were symbols of discipline and excellence. They didn't fray, they didn't stain, and they certainly didn't look tired. Which guard was it? Edward finally asked, sensing the king's persistence. "The one near the main gate." He dropped something, a notebook. "Seemed uneasy when I handed it back." Edward nodded, making a small note. "I'll have the commander check the duty roster." But that wasn't enough. Charles had spent his life around people who hid things, people who covered up their struggles. He knew what quiet suffering looked like. "I want a full report," Charles said, setting down his tea. "Not just his name, his record, his living situation, everything." Edward hesitated, just for a second, but Charles caught it. "Surely, Your Majesty, this isn't necessary." "Do it." That ended the discussion. The request was passed through the right channels quietly. No one questioned the king's curiosity, not openly, at least. By morning, a thick folder would land on his desk, mixed in with the usual briefings. And when Charles opened it, he would realize just how right his instincts had been. Something wasn't just off about that guard. Something was seriously wrong. The sun had barely risen when the confidential report arrived. It was supposed to be routine, basic details, years of service, commendations. But as Charles flipped through the pages, his stomach tightened. This was anything but routine. The guard's name was Thomas Whitaker. His record was spotless, no disciplinary issues, outstanding service, commendations for excellence. By all accounts, he was the perfect soldier. But then Charles reached the last section. Current residence. He read it once. Then again. Then a third time. No fixed address. A man who stood in front of the most famous palace in the world, who wore the uniform of honor, had no home to return to. Charles exhaled sharply, flipping through the pages. Thomas had been homeless for months. He had been sleeping in his car, washing up in public restrooms before every shift. Rising costs had forced him out of his home, and without family to turn to, he had nowhere to go. And yet, every morning, he showed up at Buckingham Palace, dressed in his uniform, standing for hours in perfect form, pretending everything was fine. Charles closed the folder, pressing his fingers against the leather cover. He felt something he hadn't expected: anger. Not at Thomas. At the system. The monarchy prided itself on discipline, tradition, and order. But what good were those things if they failed the very people who upheld them? How many others were in the same situation? Suffering in silence while the world walked past, assuming everything was fine? The day before, when Thomas took the notebook, there had been a moment of hesitation. His eyes had carried a flicker of shame, a quiet fear that the king would notice something was wrong. Now, Charles understood why. Thomas had been terrified of being seen, of having his struggle exposed. If a king knew the truth, what would happen then? Charles pushed back his chair, feeling the urge to act immediately. He wanted to find Thomas, demand answers, and fix the situation at once. But he stopped himself. This wasn't about handing out charity, it was about dignity. If he stormed in, offering help like a ruler granting favors, it would only make Thomas feel smaller. This had to be handled carefully, respectfully. Taking a steadying breath, Charles pressed a button on his desk. The voice of his secretary crackled through the intercom. "Your Majesty? Arrange a private meeting with Thomas Whitaker. Today." There was a brief pause. "The Royal Guard, sir?" Charles's voice was firm. "Yes. And tell him he has nothing to worry about. Because after today, everything was going to change." That afternoon, Thomas Whitaker stood outside the king's private office, his heart pounding. A royal guard was never called in like this. Had he made a mistake? Had someone reported him? He had always been careful, always made sure his uniform was as neat as possible despite his circumstances. But deep down, he knew his secret was out. The king knew. The door opened, and an aide gestured for him to enter. King Charles sat behind a large wooden desk, but there was no stiffness in his posture, no cold authority in his expression. He wasn't looking at Thomas like a superior reprimanding a soldier. He was simply observing him, calmly, quietly. "Thomas, is it?" the king asked. His voice was even, not harsh. "Yes, Your Majesty." There was a pause before Charles leaned forward slightly. "I won't waste your time with formalities. I read your file." Thomas's stomach clenched. His hands instinctively locked behind his back, a habit from his military days. He braced himself for what was coming: a lecture, a dismissal, a reminder that he had failed. Instead, Charles simply asked, "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Thomas hesitated. How could he explain? How could he put into words the deep humiliation of his situation? He was supposed to be strong, to endure. He was a royal guard, someone people looked at with respect. How could he admit that he had nowhere to go at the end of each shift? That after standing outside Buckingham Palace, he slept in his car, washing up in public restrooms before returning to work. "I didn't want to be a burden, sir," he finally said, his voice steady, but his palms damp. "We're trained to endure, to serve no matter what." Charles studied him for a long moment before speaking again, this time softer. "But who serves you, Thomas?" The word struck deep. No one had ever asked him that before. Not in the military, not in training, and certainly not here. "I don't need special treatment," Thomas muttered, his throat tightening. "I'll sort it out." Charles sighed and shook his head. "That's not the point." He clasped his hands together. You took an oath to serve this institution, and I took an oath to serve the people within it. That includes you." Thomas swallowed hard. For months, he had forced himself to act like nothing was wrong, to keep going despite everything. And now, the king himself was offering to help. But Charles wasn't finished. He sat back, his gaze unwavering. "As of today, you will no longer be sleeping in your car." Thomas blinked, not sure he had heard correctly. "Sir?" "I've already arranged accommodations for you," Charles continued. "And not just for you. I've ordered a full review of how we treat our service members. This won't happen again." Thomas could barely process the words. A home. Support. Just like that. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. And the king, he wasn't asking for thanks. He was simply doing what should have been done all along. Thomas walked out of the office in a daze. His training told him to maintain composure, to keep his posture straight and his face neutral. But inside, his entire world had shifted. He stepped outside, where a car was waiting. "We'll take you there now," an aide said, as if this was just another routine errand. But for Thomas, it was anything but. The car pulled up to a modest but comfortable apartment building in a quiet part of London. It wasn't extravagant, but it was clean, safe, ease. Stepping inside, Thomas paused, overwhelmed. The air smelled fresh, like a new beginning. The furniture was simple but welcoming. A small kitchen. A couch. A bed, an actual bed, not the cramped backseat of his car. For months, he had convinced himself he didn't need this, that he could manage. That asking for help was a weakness. But this wasn't charity. It was dignity. He placed his bag down carefully, almost afraid to disturb the space. His fingers brushed over the countertop, the light switch, the edge of the neatly made bed, all his. Then, on the dining table, he saw a letter bearing the royal seal. Swallowing hard, he picked it up and unfolded the crisp paper. "Thomas, you have spent your life serving others. It's time someone served you. Welcome home. Charles R." The words blurred as Thomas realized his eyes were wet. A royal guard wasn't supposed to cry. But at that moment, standing in his new home, holding a letter from the most powerful man in Britain, he let himself feel it. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. The next morning, Thomas woke up in a real bed. For a few seconds, he was confused. The ceiling above him wasn't the roof of his car. The mattress wasn't stiff leather seats. The air wasn't cold. Then it hit him. It wasn't a dream. He sat up, rubbing his hands over his face, still trying to process it all. The king had given him a home. He was no longer just an invisible guard standing at his post. He had been seen. His uniform lay neatly over a chair, freshly laundered, crisp, the way it should be. He ran his fingers over the fabric, remembering how worn it had been just days ago. Today, when he returned to Buckingham Palace, he wouldn't just be a man struggling to keep his life together. He would be a soldier standing tall again. As he took his position outside the palace gates, he felt the difference immediately. His uniform was immaculate. His posture felt stronger. The crushing exhaustion of survival was gone. Then something happened that almost made him break form. King Charles walked by. It wasn't unusual for the king to pass the guards, but this time, something was different. One by one, the other guards straightened just a little more. There was no command, no spoken words, but they all knew. They had heard. And as Charles passed, something occurred that had never happened in all of Thomas's years of service. The king gave him a nod. Not a grand gesture. Not an announcement. Just a simple, quiet acknowledgement. Thomas felt it in his bones. He had spent his whole life preparing to serve the crown. But he never expected the crown to serve him. And that was the biggest shock of all. If a king could recognize the struggles of one of his own guards and change his life overnight, what did that say about the power of simply noticing the people around us?